What I wanted to talk to you about today, of course, on the subject of Zoroastrianism, but I wanted to relate it to the subject of my field of study, my field of interest, which is conflict resolution or dispute resolution. And the more I have studied the field, the more I have become convinced that the teachings of Zoroaster have had an enormous impact over the course of time, and that the teachings of Zoroaster are very much reflected in the developing field of conflict resolution. And I'm going to talk about that and tell you in the course of this conversation something about the field of conflict resolution and how it became sort of an independent field of study. As an introduction to that, I just want, for the benefit of those of you who are visitors to the community and not so familiar with Zoroastrianism, and even for those of us who are Zoroastrians, to review some of the concepts from the Gathas, the hymns of Zoroaster, the original teachings of Zarathushtra. Some of the concepts there that are so relevant when it comes to the field of resolving conflict in this world. Conflict is something that we have always had with us, certainly in the times and long predating the time of Zoroaster. And indeed, Nietzsche has written about Zoroaster that he was the first to recognize conflict as the kind of wheel in the in the machinery of life itself. That conflict was what kind of drove progress in a way. And Zoroaster looked at the conflict between, and there are different ways you can phrase it, between right and wrong, between good and evil. There are some who object to the terminology of good and evil, and I sometimes am reluctant to use the terminology because it sounds so absolute, so moralistic as opposed to ethical. The notion that there is an absolute understanding of what is good and what is evil, rather than an evolving understanding that changes over the course of time. Indeed, for Zoroaster, the tension really, in terms of right and wrong or good and evil, that drives conflict and in a way drives life itself, is the tension between constructive or creative thinking and destructive thinking, reactive thinking that looks only to what others are trying to create, what others are trying to accomplish in a positive way, and says, no, I want to destroy that. The concept of creativity itself is a very important concept in Zoroastrianism. The term used is spenta manu, which is, in a way, you could consider the creative faculty of Ahura Mazda, which, in essence, the creative faculty of God. One Professor Farang Mayer described it as the self-generating energy that leads to the creation and evolution of the universe. So creativity itself is a major focus of Zoroaster's teaching and of the field of the philosophy of Zoroastrianism. And the idea that Zoroaster presented is that we as human beings must strive to be creative. This creative force is what is so important for humanity. In a way, we are like co-creators with God in the ever-evolving world. And in a way, Zoroastrianism is radically without hierarchy. We don't have someone in charge of our religion and someone second in command and so forth. There is not that kind of hierarchy in the religion. And even to the level of talking about God or Ahura Mazda himself, herself, is not in the sense of someone necessarily superior, but rather a co-creator. We are the co-creator with the supreme wisdom, with Ahura Mazda. And so that creativity is not only talking about the original creation, but the maintenance and promotion of that creativity over the course of time. Another concept in Zoroastrianism is the concept of the use of good mind, vahumana. And it's through our good mind, through our wisdom, through our intellect, with which we as human beings discriminate between that which is right and that which is wrong, that which is creative or constructive in this world, that which is life-affirming, and that which is destructive, or as in the words of the Gathas, that which is not life, or against life itself. Another concept that is very, very widely used throughout Zoroastrianism is the concept of asha. The concept of asha is difficult to define even in a few words. And I'm one of those who thinks that really in general we should use the word asha on its own and not translate it when we talk about the Gathas, when we talk about Zoroastrian studies, in much the same way as in some other religions, like in the Taoist religion, they talk about the Tao, T-A-O, but they don't usually translate it because it's hard to translate, or karma in the Hindu religion. Asha is, in a way, asha is not dissimilar from the concept of the Tao in Taoism. It is the path or the way. Dr. Jaffrey has referred to it as the doing the right thing at the right time to achieve the right result. Another sort of loose translation of it is that which fits, that which facilitates the path of creativity. When it's translated with one word in English, asha is often translated as truth or as righteousness. And those are certainly factors, certainly elements in it, but they can be misleading. But truth in the sense that Zarathustra taught that we must be on a relentless and never-ending search for the truth, an uncompromising search for the truth, that we shouldn't be using safety nets when we search for the truth. It never stops, and it is continuous. Another concept in Zoroastrianism, a symbol of the religion, is the symbol of fire, Aurthur. Many have mistaken over the course of years that fire is widely present in Zoroastrian ceremonies and Zoroastrian symbolism. Many have mistaken over the period of years that the Zoroastrians were worshippers of fire, or worshippers of a fire god. And nothing could be further from the truth. Fire is merely a symbol in Zoroastrianism, but a very important one. Fire in the Gathas of Zarathustra represents the radiant light, the mental light, warmth, and energy that help us to be as creative as we can. And then there's the concept of dana, which is conscience, a kind of conscience in an individual way, and conscience as a fellowship of human beings, of individuals who actively join together in promoting what Zarathustra calls the living world. It is a collaborative effort. And finally, a word that you hear very commonly in Zoroastrianism, very commonly because it's often used as a greeting for hello or even goodbye, is ushta, which again is a word that does not translate perfectly, but it basically means, as I understand it, enlightened happiness, radiant happiness, happiness that is not only happiness for the person experiencing it, but that radiates and brings happiness to others. As it says in the Gathas, happiness be the lot of the person who works for the happiness of others. And so these are some essential concepts in Zoroastrianism. And Zoroaster himself understood the nature, the core nature of conflict in this world. Now, the field that I have come to specialize in is the field known as conflict resolution or dispute resolution. And it started as a field by that name. It's undergone different phases. But in the late 1970s, there arose a field, or it became recognized as an independent field of study known as alternative dispute resolution, or ADR. And this field, as a separate field of study, arose in the context of the field of law, really. The alternative in alternative dispute resolution was an alternative to litigation, to expensive and destructive contests in the legal sphere. Now, in point of fact, the field of alternative dispute resolution is really cobbled together from many fields, and there's also been, over the course of the last 20 years or so, a lot of combined studies, because people have studied conflict in a way, and the making of war, for example, war and peace, for a long time. And some of the alternatives to litigation have existed long before we ever invented the idea of courts. Alternatives such as mediation, where you have a third party that comes and tries to bring the parties together to understand each other and to reach some kind of a settlement that is sensible to both the parties. One of the things that the field of conflict resolution recognizes as a field of study is that conflict is inevitable. Conflict per se is not something bad. Indeed, conflict, as Zarathustra understood, is in a way the living engine, the wheel of the progress of our society and of our understanding. And that the field of conflict resolution understands that, or many in the field understand that conflict itself is a kind of learning process, and that if we use conflict to our benefit, rather than seeing it as something simply to prevent, that we actually can advance ourselves and advance the happiness of humanity. One of the key elements in the field of conflict resolution is the understanding of the importance of creativity, of constructiveness in developing solutions to conflict. Is the notion of taking conflict and using it as that learning tool. This concept pervades the field of conflict resolution, and what brings me such pleasure is that each time I read about it in some esoteric journal or some study or analysis of it, it really is a reflection of many of the simple words of Zarathustra in the Gathas. One of the techniques that is very commonly used in dispute resolution, particularly for constructive negotiations, for mediation and so forth, is the technique of brainstorming, of absolutely unlocking our minds and letting us think of every possibility, even if it's absolutely crazy. We write down everything if the parties are prepared to do that. They just come up with ideas, and most of the ideas may mean nothing, or they may be completely silly. But the idea is to get as creative as possible, as inventive as possible, and use our good minds to develop this creativity. Part of the essence of conflict resolution is the notion of using these techniques and understanding of the nature of conflict to bring about, in the end, better outcomes. And it is very similar in a way to Zoroaster's concept of asha, doing the right thing at the right time to achieve the right result. Better outcomes is what conflict resolution is all about. One of the principles that has developed in the field of conflict resolution is the principle of it's known by different names: an integrative approach to conflict resolution, a problem-solving approach to conflict resolution, or an interest-based approach to conflict resolution. For those of you who have read the book Getting to Yes by Roger Fisher, you would have read something about this notion. But the basic idea is that when individuals or groups are in conflict, the important thing is not to just look at the positions that they are taking, because conflict is always about what you see on the surface are two different positions. If they didn't have two different positions, there would be no conflict. Rather, it is looking beneath those positions to seeing what are the underlying interests. It is relentlessly asking the question, why? And this is consistent with Zarathustra's teaching of a relentless search for the truth, a relentless digging underneath, that we're not satisfied with a superficial answer. An example of this kind of interest-based approach to problem solving or conflict resolution, some of you may have heard, it's a very commonly given example, but it illustrates it quite nicely. It's the example of two people fighting over a crate of oranges, a big box of oranges. And they both feel that they are entitled to the oranges, and they're arguing about it. And there are 50 oranges in the box, and they're talking about different ways to divide it, and one feels more entitled to more of the oranges. The other one thinks that they should have the whole box. And they argue, and they argue, and they fight over it. It turns out, when someone thinks to dig beneath that and ask, well, why do you want these oranges? It turns out that one of the persons wants the oranges to make orange juice. The other person wants the pulp of the oranges and the rind to make marmalade. And in fact, together they can have absolutely everything that they want. They can each have all 50 oranges for the reason that they want it, because you're looking below, you're looking at what is it that you really want? What are your real interests here? This kind of concept has also been used with varying degrees of success in the area of international peacemaking. Roger Fisher, in his book, gives the example of the Sinai peace accords between Israel and Egypt. The lead up to that for decades, decades of struggle between them, and then the capture of the Sinai in 1967 by Israel. And the lead up was just absolute positions. The Israelis saying, we will not withdraw from the Sinai. And the Egyptians saying that you must withdraw, and you must withdraw from all of the Sinai. And then they went to war again, and Egypt recaptured part of it, but Israel still was in possession of most of the Sinai. And the fighting still went on, and the diplomatic entanglements went on, and they looked at many different kinds of solutions. And the Israelis had put in a number of settlements in the Sinai Peninsula. And it was very, very difficult. The positions were diametrically opposed. We want all the Sinai that we have, we want to keep it. And the Egypt's response was, we want every bit of it back. And there were efforts at compromise and so forth. At some point, Begin was willing to give up part of the Sinai, and the Egyptians were insistent, it is our land, we want every bit of it back, and it was all positional. But the interest-based approach finally prevailed in that conflict, and it was to look at what are your underlying interests? Why are you saying what you are saying? And the Egyptians, their approach is, well, we are saying this because it's a simple matter of international law. This is internationally recognized as our territory. It has always been our territory. And it is a bedrock principle that you shouldn't have to give up your territory just because of war. And we will not give up even an inch of it. And the Israeli response was, well, our interest is we value our security. And Israel is a tiny country, and by having the entire Sinai right up against there, back before 67, there were masses of tanks and armies in the Sinai, which also had controlled Israel's access to the Gulf of Aqaba. Israel said, we cannot take that risk, that security risk. In the end, the interest-based solution was Israel would give up every bit of the Sinai. That was the agreement. And that would satisfy Egypt's interest. Egypt would maintain sovereignty over the Sinai. In return, however, the Sinai would be completely demilitarized, and there would be early warning stations manned by international groups in the Sinai to completely satisfy Israel's concern with security. As you know, the story isn't an entirely happy one over the course of time, but it did end the state of war between Egypt and Israel, and has been successful in that sense for some years. So the notion is, when you take an interest-based approach, when you continue to ask why, when you delve underneath and keep working at the truth and keep trying to be creative about it, eventually you can, even when there's an aspect of wrongness in each side or in the other side, you can, as Zarathustra says in the Gathas, deliver wrong into the hands of righteousness, deliver wrong into the hands of right. And that is what we keep striving for as human beings. It is also a very important notion in the field of conflict resolution, the notion of working collaboratively. That when people get together to cooperate and be collaborative about their creativity, that this is more successful in the long run. That if you just look at it selfishly, you can accomplish some things, but in fact, it is far more powerful in the course of time to be collaborative, to work together. And indeed, this is true throughout nature, that there are obviously all kinds of examples of conflict in nature, but there are even more examples of collaboration among different forces of nature. And this Zoroastrian principle has been very heavily applied throughout the study of conflict resolution. So, in sum, I like to, part of what gives me the energy to pursue the field of conflict resolution that I have had is the notion that I feel that it is also consistent with my philosophy of life. And I was having a conversation with Richard just before this, how we, each in our own way, came to become Zoroastrians. Neither one of us were born to it, but both as we studied and read and found out about it, found that this really was a much more eloquent, more beautiful statement of really the philosophy of life that we already had. The lovely woman who came and sang opera to us said at the outset that she is not a Zoroastrian, that she is a musician who sees her role as bringing beauty to life every day. And I must correct her. She doesn't know it, but she is a Zoroastrian, because that is much what You mean the year or the month? Well, the month is the month of March. We're pretty clear. We're pretty clear about that. The year is something that's much more controversial. For a long time, it was understood because of one of the Greeks who had written about it that Zarathustra was around the time, I believe, of 600 or so BC. But more and more scholarly research that places the time of Zoroaster using various information from the Gathas and what we know about that time, and linguistic information and information about the position of stars and so forth and references, suggests that Zoroaster probably was born around 2000 BC or earlier. Yes, sir?
At the end of your speech, you said that conflict resolution is in essence delivering wrong into the hand of righteousness. Is that is that the summary of the correlation between Zoroastrianism and conflict resolution, or was there something else? I was listening throughout your speech and waiting for a light bulb to go off, but for the correlation, where is that it?
No, I mean that was sort of tying a ribbon around the package. There are a number of elements in conflict resolution that are very much embodied in Zoroaster's teaching. In particular, the notion of creativity, the notion of being creative in our approach to life and our approach to conflict, of being constructive. The notion of listening to others and trying to build together with others on what's happening. The notion that conflict itself is a kind of lesson for us, is a kind of learning process for us. The notion that what we should be seeking to do is not just look at our individual notion of happiness, but a collective notion of happiness, of bringing happiness not just to ourselves, but to others. Zoroaster said that the person that seeks happiness at the expense of others is that doing that is like taking poison. So all of these concepts are very much interwoven into the field of conflict resolution. In the end, I mean, I think a way of saying it very broadly is taking that which is wrong, that which we see as wrong in the process of conflict, and using our creative power to deliver it into the hands, taking the path of Asha, delivering it into the hands of righteousness.
Hi,
yes.
First I wanted to thank you for your presentation. This was wonderful. As someone who's in the area of conflict resolution, who is a Zoroastrian, it's wonderful to see this. Second, how can I find your work? Have you published papers, books?
My work on Zoroastrianism or on conflict resolution?
Well, the two actually, what you presented today.
Well, the only thing that I've quote unquote published, it's published on the web, is on voman.org, and I have several pieces on that, but one in particular on conflict resolution. It's very short. I have in the field of Zoroastrianism, notwithstanding what Armand says, I don't consider myself a scholar. I like to consider myself someone who is extremely interested in it and has spent a lot of time doing amateur research. But I certainly haven't published scholarly works. As far as the field of conflict resolution, if you give me your email, I'll be glad to send you some sites or some materials. Yes, sir.
What I have seen or heard or learned about Zoroastrianism, two fairly different, separate views of God. Maybe similar, but still different. One is God as most people know God, all powerful up there, and the other is a little bit more liberal view of God, which is in your heart, in your mind, and what you make of God as a person. How did you know God before, if any different than after you became a Zoroastrian?
That's a very interesting question, and one that I'll at least start to answer, but could take me several hours, and so I'm sure I will be stopped. But I will tell you, in my understanding, I feel strongly about this, but it doesn't mean that people can't disagree. In my understanding, Zoroaster refers to Ahura Mazda. He never used the word God. The word God is a translation that really it's us looking through the lenses of the Judeo-Christian heritage that we have here. And Zarathushtra never said that. But the best understanding that people can have who come from that sort of Western heritage is the use of the term God. But I personally don't believe that Zoroaster referred in any way to a transcendent, all-powerful God to whom we submit. Rather, I like to think of Ahura Mazda as the mind of the universe, the creative mind energy of the whole universe that is the precondition for everything that has come since, and in a way the inspiration for everything that has come since, but not someone that is telling us in every aspect of our lives what to do and how to do it, and to whom that we look to as simply as authority, and it's right because God says it's right. Rather, his notion of right and wrong is very much a notion of reality, of what works here on this earth and in this life, to improve the lot of human beings, to improve, to bring about happiness, and to be life-affirming in this world. That's my notion of, quote, God.